and then people begin to see, well, this is sort of a good idea. Even though I haven't studied any history, this seems like a nice idea. And then, it gets too deep. People get too deep in it.
Mm.
They develop no self-criticism or whatever.
Yeah, they get sort of to such a delusion that they incapable of seeing it even. Like, I don't know.
Okie dokie, here it comes. It's Bohica time. No, anyway. Excuse me. Oh, bloody hell. There it is. Sheer sand. Well, let's see. Yes, welcome all. It's Dis and Dat, Thursday, 10 April. God, time flies when you're having fun. Um, Welcome to Dis and Dat, Frankfurt School and Political Economy. And this may have appeared earlier, but this is a different one or an additional one. And once you start going down that rabbit hole, it gets really crazy. So generally, what I've been doing, I've been sitting in on this um, writing workshop or reading group or whatever for Frankfurt School Critical Theory, which does really interesting work. Each of the people who are engaged in it have interesting, sort of things they're working on. And I'm just sort of riffing off of that, but I appreciate the translations are pretty good and reasonable and interesting. And they started with the concept of rackets, which sort of is not unlike Marx worrying about rents. Similarly, and a similar kind of problem too, but that's another story. The literature is interesting. It got me off looking at Friedrich Pollock, and testing whether, as some authors will say, that there's a certain hostility of Horkheimer and Adorno to political economy. But I think they have certain reasons to be that way because they were confronting the problematic of orthodox, whether it was orthodox economics in general, that is neoclassical, or orthodox Marxism, whose economics or economism is problematic in and of itself. So, see Stalin, all those things are problematic because, right, they're writing in the 1940s, and it's not so much they persist in that notion, but they persist in a set of ideas that's kind of important and becomes more important in the revival in the 1960s when Adorno's still alive, Marcuse is still alive. Stuff. There's stuff there. It's interesting stuff and worth considering because you can see with this racket stuff that there's a certain institutional element there, not only with Adolf Lowe and Pollock, and of course the safety, as it were, to engage in critical thought in the U.S. rather than in the belly of the beast during World War II. So that's kind of where this literature comes from. And it is a literature, it has a literature, it is the conflict, as it were, that many, many have observed between political economy theories or ideas and cultural studies ideas. And of course, you can weave that however you want. And of course, the right wing has made that into its so-called cultural Marxism problem. Um, I just am waiting for the journalist to ask that question of Herr Krasnov in the White House, who apparently today somebody figured out where the original tariff theory came from, and it came from his the head of his Council of Economic Advisors, who had an idea, but Trump screwed it up. It's kind of like they gave him a model kit, and then he suddenly decided to toss out the instructions, and it just went wherever it went, and there we are now. Okay. I begin with a illustration of the comparison, which is a problematic comparison for all the usual reasons, between wealth distribution in France from 1760 to 1790. Of course, you can see what the issue was in terms of the top 10% versus the rest of the country and France during the first revolutionary period. and the wealth distribution in the United States up at in 2016, and you can see, gee, there's a similarity. But anyway, that's making these comparisons doesn't get us anywhere necessarily because, as we recall, there weren't a lot of people actually in the Bastille when they liberated the Bastille, etc. So, your mileage may vary. So here is a little guest editorial. It introduces a collection, which maybe we'll get to more of them, but this sort of is an overview, a guest editorial in a special issue of the history of the human sciences. Note, of course, that human sciences is a broad uh, covering model for a variety of things, ranging from wacky ideas like semiotics to, other base fieldwork in anthropology. It can do all kinds of stuff. So here's the abstract, and then we'll continue on with this. I may not get to the end, but I think you'll get the point by probably the middle of this. The following introduction is two parts. Oh, this is Matthias Roth and Bastian Rong. It's a article in the History of Human Sciences, 2016, Frankfurt School and Political issue on Frankfurt School and the political economy. Two parts. The first part provides a sketch of the Frankfurt School's history, highlighting the circumstances under which the authors discussed in this issue engaged philosophically with matters of economy. We thereby follow the prevailing periodization, starting with the school's foundation in 1924 and ending with Theodore W. Adorno's death in 1969 and the school's preliminary dissolution. The second part of the introduction explores the legacy of the Frankfurt School's philosophical critique of economy. Max Horkheimer's writing thereby serves as a model case for such a critique and become the point of departure for the discussion of contemporary critical theories of the economic. Now, this is 2016. Note who becomes president, etc. And it, of course, has corresponding authors, etc., etc. All right. Historical perspective, the precariousness of societal contradictions. These were the good times when it was still possible to write a critique of the political economy of this society, Adorno 2012, actually 1916. The scope of critique, that is, defining totality. This issue of the History of Human Sciences discusses various theorists from the Frankfurt School of Social Research and from their immediate environment, among them authors that have rarely been the center of attention: Alfred Sohn-Rethel, George Lukács, Henrik Grossmann, Friedrich Pollock, Otto Kirchheimer, Theodore W. Adorno, and Max Horkheimer. Such a collection of thinkers might seem odd, yes, yet this constellation of disciplinary provenances and theoretical stances make visible the first concern at hand, the presentation of a diversity of Marxisms and of a broad range of engagements with political economy and economy at large. Within critical theory, a term that has become a synonym for the Frankfurt School endeavors since Max Horkheimer's 1937 quote-unquote manifesto, traditional and critical theory, which we will come back to at some moment, but because I think it's worth rereading for all the usual reasons. Such diversity can be discerned only after defining the ground that these theorists nevertheless have in common: the assumption that society is a whole, W-H-O-L-E, and that society's totality can be grasped from the point of view of its modes of reproduction. Marx's political economy, then, employing such categories as value, profit, class, relations of production, and forces of production, was widely understood as an outstanding attempt to capture such totality. That is, it was seen as breaking through the surface level of phenomena and accessing the very foundation of society. There is also agreement on at least one enemy, commonly named positivism. The target was the largely empiricist orientation of the social and, in particular, of the economic sciences. In 1928, Alfred Sohn-Rethel gave a poignant description of the problem attendant on such empiricism. Most contemporary economic theories, Sohn-Rethel maintained, detach the economic sphere from the social. Or for better or worse, he claimed economic science had, since its foundation in the late 18th century, had been conceived as a social science, Gesellschaft, Wissenschaft, that is, economic practices had understood with reference to reason or freedom. They had been derived from history as part of the evolution of society, or at least had been thought of in close relation to social institutions that were themselves subject to change. The equation of economy and social sciences severed, he stated dryly in 1928. Economy was now presumed to be merely activity or behavior that could be studied empirically and reconceptualized along these lines. It came to be understood as a timeless rationality. In the very successful school of marginalism, for example, it was redefined as the individual calculation of costs and benefits. Such a move had immensely important consequences, according to Son Rethel. Paradoxically, it was this limitation in scope that made economic thinking, that is, thinking in terms of costs and benefits, ubiquitous and led to an economization of previously spared spheres of life. In other words, the social or societal, of which economic relations are but one part, disappeared from view in favor of an idea of society that comprised the activity of calculating and atomized individual actors. Economic practices themselves no longer had to stand up to social criticism. The only form of critique that remained possible was that of experts. Yet it is worth noting that for Son Rethel, this was but a side concern, merely a symptom of a much bigger problem. Once the bond between economy and society was severed, which amounted to the same thing for the theorists assembled in this issue, this published issue, once a concept of totality was abandoned, critique as such loses its scope, whatever its specific target may be. Well, yes and no. But the agreement ended when it came to defining totality. The debate quickly became one about the lasting validity of Marx's categories. Does Marx's political economy provide only a model for understanding society's totality? Now, if so, can and must analogous categories be found? Or are Marx's concepts flexible enough to account for contemporary and future societal developments? At stake, in particular, was the assumption that all societal dynamics and thus all hope for emancipation can be located in the antagonism between the relations of production and the forces of production. The forces of production, or the productive capacities, including needs and expectations that develop within them, the story commonly went, will ultimately come into irreconcilable conflict with the relations of production. That is, the way the forces are put to use, namely through the free market and private ownership. Remember what we did yesterday, and thus produce capitalism's final crisis. Such interpretation of Marx was at the heart of the revolutionary program as well as of the social democratic reformist agenda since the 19th century. The arrival of socialism, the superior order that could accommodate and foster society's productive capacities, appeared to be inscribed in the course of history. The Frankfurt School officially changed course on most of these questions in 1931. When Max Horkheimer took over its directorship since 1924, its mission had been the institutionalization of Marxist research methods with a focus on the history of the working class. Marxism was understood as a science investigating social existence in its never-ending, constantly renewed transformation. This is cited in Viggerhaus. The general direction of these perpetual changes was not at issue, and Karl Grünberg, the Institute's first director, was not shy about professing his conviction of the lasting effectiveness of the antagonisms between productive forces and relations at the Institute's inauguration. Quote, many people whose numbers and influence are constantly growing are firmly scientifically convinced that we're in the midst of the transition from capitalism to socialism and are advancing towards the latter with gathering speed. Silly wabbit. Anyway, thus history's tendencies, unquote, thus history's tendencies can be read out of the empirical data by means of Marx's famous categories. Horkheimer's inaugural speech suggested a different perspective. He argued for a dialectical penetration of philosophical theory and specialized scientific praxis. He spoke about the importance of Kant and Hegel. This new emphasis on philosophical theory should not be understood as a departure from economics. The economy is the first cause of wretchedness, and critique, theoretical and practical, must address itself primarily to it. Thus seen, Horkheimer remained faithful to the Marxist tradition. Rather, the problem was economic reductionism in all its forms. See, orthodoxy, including the one now practiced by traditional Marxism, that is, the reification of Marxist political economy, its translation into historical laws, and the subsequent complacent mechanical application of Marxian categories to all social phenomena. Economism, to which critical theory is often reduced, Horkheimer stated in 1937, quote, does not consist in giving too much importance to economy, but in giving it too narrow a scope, unquote. And too narrow a scope had the precise meaning of, on the one hand, failing to address phenomena as parts of a societal whole, and on the other, not taking into account that society is an open totality whose constitution is contingent upon the changes of its parts. That is, ultimately, it is grounded in the materiality of the existing social relations. Philosophy, idealist philosophy, which had preceded and developed into Marxism via Hegel, was assigned the task of preserving the awareness of such constitutive openness. At the same time, philosophy was set up as an antidote to traditional Marxism and to the empiricism of the social sciences. It's a cautionary tale went by the name of metaphysics, a label assigned to philosophical inquiry whenever it loses touch with the materiality of the social world and instead proposes a transcendental foundation, be it in the relations of production and forces of production, in being as such, or in subjectivity writ large. Much could be said about Horkheimer's dictatorial policies that could not but compromise the Institute's anti-authoritarian stance. They were effects of the Institute's legal setup, that is, the Society for Social Research, a foundation created by Felix Lix Weil, Marxist economist and principal sponsor, provided the Institute's financial resources and board of trustees, and also transferred to the director far-reaching powers pertaining to hiring and firing, salaries, and the administration of finances, powers that Horkheimer seemed to have applied David et impera, see Doge. Yet the new direction announced by Horkheimer in 1931 did not end the diversity of positions. On the contrary, it produced such diversity by bringing the theoretical and political stakes out into the open. The variety of positions presented by the Institute's journal, the Studies in Philosophy and Social Science, dedicated to showcase and to archive its work, is impressive. Invited contributors included, for example, Ferdinand Tönnies, Otto Neurath, and Alexander Korre, and the variety within the close-knit circle of Frankfurt School theorists is perhaps best exemplified by the numerous papers dedicated to the analysis of National Socialism. This debate became a focal point for a renewed inquiry into the makeup of society's totality. It also raised the question of how much philosophy was needed and had to be added to political economy to account for the socioeconomic changes that National Socialism, i.e., Nazism, stood for. The responses to this latter question constitute the important concern of this theory, this issue of history of the human sciences. Tentatively speaking, Horkheimer, Pollock, and Adorno, who became part of the Institute's inner circle only in 1938, seem to have prepared the path for a predominantly philosophical analysis of society, whereas Grossman, like Pollock, a core member of the Institute since its inauguration in 1924, seems to have remained faithful to a traditional Marxist understanding of society. Sohn-Rethel, and lastly Kirchheimer and Neumann, who both joined the Institute in the late 1930s, seem to have ended up in an intermediate position. On the one hand, they remain true to a traditional Marxist understanding of society. Sohn-Rethel and lastly Kirchheimer, in an intermediate position. On the one hand, they remain true to a traditional Marxist analysis. On the other, perhaps an unavoidable result of their empirical bent, they could not but realize that the contradiction between productive forces and relations of production had long ceased to produce a revolutionary subject. Yet caution is necessary here. Any such grouping can be conveniently made only retroactively and should not be taken for an irreconcilable divide. First, what had become precarious in the late 1930s was not the common ground. neither the necessity of a concept of totality nor the assumption that such totality can be grasped from the point of view of society's mode of reproduction was under scrutiny. What had become precarious in view of National Socialism was the idea that the contradiction between relations of production and forces of production still provided a useful anchor point for an understanding of totality, and that emancipatory potential resided in class struggle. Second, the fact that the various disciplinary and theoretical approaches to what many saw as a qualitatively new relationship between the political and the economic were juxtaposed in the Institute's journal indicates that positions were in flux. The debate itself had a heuristic value, and the major works resulting from it should be read less as adopting a position than as being informed by its entirety. Number two, revolution or the leap out. Philosophy despite political economy. Max Horkheimer's 1931 inaugural speech defended philosophy and advocated for Fichte, Kant, and Hegel. Today, it is somewhat difficult to comprehend why philosophy was in need of defense, but such pleadings were not unprecedented. Karl Korsch with Marxismus, Marxismus und Philosophie, and George Lukács famously with Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, Bewusstsein, had already fought a similar battle in 1923, and both were severely reprimanded by the party orthodoxy. It was dogma on the political left that Marx's political economy, as the outcome of idealism, the peak of bourgeois philosophy, had sublated philosophy as such. Horkheimer still struggled with this assumption and its implication in traditional and critical theory of 1937, as did Herbert Marcuse, who joined the Institute in 1932 in his programmatic essay, Philosophy and Critical Theory of 1937. At the time of its origin, in the 30s and 40s of the 19th century, philosophy was the most advanced form of consciousness. Once critical theory had recognized the responsibility of economic conditions for the totality of the established world, philosophy became superfluous. Problems bearing on the potentialities of man and of reason could now be approached from the standpoint of economics. But because philosophy was preserved within political economy, Marcuse continued, each of its concepts was more than just an economic concept. What Marx's materialism had inherited from idealist philosophy was an orientation towards freedom and the insight that freedom consisted in reconciliation between the individual and the universal, that it was contingent on the rule of reason over being. With Marxism, then, Marcuse concluded this line of reasoning, quote, in 1937, a social situation has come about in which the realization of reason no longer needs to be restricted to pure thought and will. If reason means shaping life according to man's free decision, then the demand for reason henceforth means the creation of a social organization in which individuals can collectively regulate their lives in accordance with their needs. With the realization of reason in such a society, philosophy would disappear. Unquote. The subjunctive would deserves attention here. That is, reason did not rule, and philosophy was not sublated, or as Marx said, realized. Hence, philosophy haunted Marx's political economy with its unfulfilled promises, perhaps the reversal of that other haunting, that is, the haunting by the specter of communism. Philosophy, Marcuse and Horkheimer held, prevented not only a fallback into empiricism, but also Marxism's blind trust in the proper functioning of the economic antagonisms. Quote, critical theory is, last but not least, critical of itself. The philosophical element in the theory is a form of protest against the new economism, which would isolate the economic struggle and separate the economic from the political sphere. In unquote, in Zonrethel's words, philosophy had to maintain the connection between economic inquiry and freedom, yet do so from within Marxism. A comparison with Korsch's and Lukács's attempts, both in 1923, to make a case for philosophy and Marxism might be instructive here. Korsch also agreed with the assumption that Marxism makes philosophy superfluous and ultimately sublates it. He envisioned this not only in the form of a single intellectual deed of Marx and Engels, but as a very long and arduous revolutionary process. This is 1923. Marx's capital course claimed, accordingly, was not Marxism in the state of maturity. Rather, it represented a response to the weakening of revolutionary movements and was an attempt to win minds via the path or detour of science. With the reawakening of revolutionary forces in the 20th century, it would become necessary, Korsch maintained, to resume the fight against philosophy, which implied a return to Marx's early philosophical writings, right? The 1844, etc. At stake was not so much the preservation of idealism within Marxism or to sustain its haunting, but a reinvigoration of Marxism. For this to become possible, Marxism itself had again to become the only true philosophy. In a very similar vein, Lukács sought to lead Marxism back to a direct confrontation with its neglected origin of idealism in order to induce a revolutionary turn. The proletariat then would become the identical subject-object, the subject of action. Lukács in 1923. Their language was carried by actionism. In 1923, Weimar, all the signs pointed to an imminent dissolution of the existing order. Parliamentary, that is, representational democracy, which inhibited real life, that is, immediacy, from taking place. Far and wide, philosophy declared itself performative, hoping to bring about rupture. Such experience was temporarily complex. The future seemed to have already arrived unannounced and had not yet been owned by the people. Crisis, as Rudiger Graf has shown in detailed analysis, was associated with hope across all political divides. The hope that crisis would bring societal life to the point of decision. Most intellectuals, Graf included, considered the horrible, low state of the present not as the end, but believed that the current crisis was a state of extremely severe confused fermentation heading towards a near light and better future. Many examples of the phenomenon alluded to by Graf can be identified here. Carl Schmitt advocated for the exception because with it, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. Walter Benjamin envisioned the breaking of the cycle of the dialectical rising and falling in the forms of violence. Siegfried Krakauer of film theory recognized the individual in the mass ornament still behind the barrier of abstractions, yet he hoped the individual would finally transgress the self-imposed boundaries. This is 1927. And Martin Heidegger, the most famous theorist of alienation alongside Lukács, conceptualized an authentic being that already dwelled in the inauthentic and would finally overcome the they constituted by the way things had been publicly interpreted, which expresses itself in idle talk. That's in 1927. Such expectations were continuously fueled by political unrest and economic turmoil. If Horkheimer's 1931 defense of philosophy still cautiously evoked the hope of revolution, and thus was still aligned to Korsch's and Lukács's project, this could no longer have been the case in 1937 with philosophy and critical theory. But philosophy had not come to assume the exclusive function of a memorial to lost opportunities and pending promises. It also, at least for Horkheimer and Adorno, needed to investigate the state of stasis itself and to illuminate society's immanence. From within the totality defined by political economy, philosophy took over the relay, so to speak, once it became clear that societal antagonism would not bring about liberation. Philosophy now had to speak in place of political economy. The limits of the existing order, that is, totality, could currently be circumscribed only negatively. Now, in doing so, philosophy prepared society not for revolution, the next stage of societal development, but for ultimate rupture. Following Benjamin's theses On the Concept of History, insights in which we must view as theoretical axioms, that is, Horkheimer, letter to Adorno in 1941, cited in Vigor House 86, Horkheimer stated, the authoritarian state that dialectic is not identical with development is not a further acceleration of progress, but a qualitative leap out of the dimension of progress. Section 3, rethinking the relationship between the political and the economic. Let me take a break here to refresh the clock, and I will start again in a second. It's not doing it. Come on. Definitely is not doing it. Come on. All righty. Oh, God. We need to figure out how long the yammer goes. When Marcuse spoke out against the separation of the economic from the political sphere in 1937, to which challenges exactly was he responding? First, the economic battle in the traditional Marxist sense was one of class struggle. It involved an idea of a necessary, that is, lawful final crisis of capitalism once the forces of production were irredeemably in conflict with the relations of production, which seemed to have been the case worldwide in the early 1930s. Mass strikes, the worldwide depression, et cetera, et cetera. Unemployment peaked, sales and consumption stalled. The progressive concentration of capital in the form of monopolies, see today, rendered the free market ineffective. Thus, objectively, according to the common reading of Marx's political economy, the conditions for liberation had been met. Yet, not only had this opportunity been missed, worse, with the rise of National Socialism, the opposite course had been taken toward total domination. It became evident that the objectively existing economic possibility of a liberated society did not automatically translate into revolutionary consciousness. What had been underestimated in all revolutionary scenarios, it seemed, was the subject-forming force of society, or those horizontal forces, that is, political and other, of societal integration. Second, the new political order that emerged from the crisis of economic liberalism, National Socialism, seemed to employ means that were not dissimilar to those the Frankfurt School theorists had imagined as remedies. Above all, the emphasis on centralized economic planning, which is certainly not happening now. National Socialism, and not least the situation in the Soviet Union, gave a painful demonstration of the fact that what appeared to be the end of a free market economy of classes and of the private disposition over property was entirely compatible with brutal domination. Under National Socialism, politics, that is, the state, interfered massively with the free play of economic forces. If the first concern already drew into question the idea of the emancipatory potential of the contradiction between forces and relations of production, the second had implications that reached even further. That antagonism itself might not be a solution, but part of the problem. Forces of production developed on a large industrial scale might bear affinity with an all-encompassing authoritarian administration. The engagement of critical theory with contemporary economic thought, as well as with psychology and sociology, should then be interpreted in the context of these challenges. Historian Martin Jay, acknowledges the breadth of economic discussions within the Frankfurt School, but he warns, quote, it would be an error to argue that these economic analyses were really integrated into the heart of critical theory. Horkheimer and Adorno were never serious students of economics, Marxist or otherwise, unquote. Yet the Institute practiced a form of division of labor that is different from today's idea of interdisciplinary research. The borders of the individual disciplines were respected. The endeavor was instead multidisciplinary. Your mileage may vary. Hence, it might be adequate to say that the specific disciplines had continuously to inform the debates within the Institute, and they provided an empirical resource for the theoretically more encompassing articles that became the hallmark of critical theory, a resource from which various and often opposite conclusions could be drawn. Now, the following list comprises all articles from the body of the Institute's journal that were dedicated exclusively to political economy and contemporary economic theory and practice. This is a good list, and I think will inform further investigation once one can track down perhaps English translations. There's one from 1932 that has Grossman and Pollock, 1933, Bauman, Pollock, and Rusch, 1934, Mandelbaum and Meyer, 1935, Grossman, Mandelbaum, Meyer, and Wittvogel. 36, Bauman, Mandelbaum, and Weil. 37, Seyring, Aron, Weil in 38, Wittvogel, and then 41, Gorland and Pollock. These essays display a double interest. On the one hand, a focus on the peculiarity of the socioeconomic makeup of National Socialism, that is, Weil, Pollock, Gorland, and Meyer, and on the other, a more broadly oriented investigation of concepts and practices of economic planning, including discussions of Roosevelt's New Deal and Keynes's economic theory, that is, Kurt and Erich Bauman, Mandelbaum, Weil, Seyring. Furthermore, they are accompanied by a presentation of Wittvogel's research on China's socioeconomic structure, which is, of course, its own interesting element. It is not difficult to see that such thematic orientation supported a new valorization of the political. The centrality assumed by questions of planning implies that politics was seen as potentially more than just a reflection of a foundational economic structure. There's a governmentality and governance are implied. The simultaneous discussions of contemporary economic policies and theories from across the political spectrum provided an incentive for a shift of attention away from classical Marxist political economy to questions of government and authoritarianism, a category that eventually comprised, as problematic as this might be, National Socialism, the Soviet Union, and the New Deal as variants of state interventionism. Wittvogel's empirical data on China seem to have thereby functioned as a catalyst, but the exploration of society's economic base structure and the interest in its mode of reproduction were not abandoned, contrary to theories of totalitarianism, which likewise associated Nazism, communism, and often the New Deal with one another. Horkheimer, for example, made the existence of large centralized industrial production the most important commonality between different forms of state interventionism. It was this base to which the state responded, and economic distinctions were reintroduced within the renewed frame of inquiry, that is, after the reevaluation of the political. Such distinctions and their relative weight then constituted the thrust of the debates within the Institute in the late 1930s. Thus, it might well be that instead of having betrayed Marxism by abandoning economic analysis, critical theory, in fact, hit a nerve by touching upon a qualitatively new paradigm of governing the economic, a form that is perhaps still with us under the title of neoliberalism. And there's the, the money shot, as they say. Because, of course, neoliberalism operates with state intervention and centralizes capital, but in whose name, of course. In this issue's articles, Manfred Gangl and Rick Kuhn revisit the Institute's debate on politics and the economy, usually subsumed under the name state capitalism debate. Their contributions lay bare the different positions on political economy within critical theory, and they investigate the contentious relationship between economic analysis and philosophical inquiry, the latter of which Kuhn holds led to the progressive marginalization of one of the Institute's founding members, Henrik Grossman. Werner Bonfeld discusses Adorno's reassessment of Marx's political economy and of the categories of class struggle and productive forces. He argues that Adorno's negative dialectics does not break with economic analysis. On the contrary, although technically philosophy, it practices an economic analysis under the conditions of a qualitatively new relationship between politics and economy. Frank Engster investigates comparatively how Lukács, Sonrathel, and Adorno theorize the subject-forming force of the capitalist economy. These theorists, Engster claims, all prioritize the category of exchange over the category of labor, and thus break with traditional Marxism. They understand subject formation in the wake of German idealist philosophy as resulting from the mediation between subject and object through the commodity form. Carsten Olson's point of departure is the claim that with Otto Kirchheimer, the Frankfurt School theorists welcomed Carl Schmitt's political philosophy into their circle. Olson argues, drawing on Alphonse Solner's work, that this is far from being the case and discusses in detail the status of economic analysis in the work of Schmitt and Kirchheimer. Finally, Karina Cordella deals in depth with Alfred Sohn-Rethel's attempt to combine Marxian analysis with Kant's transcendentalism for the sake of a materialist epistemology. Oh, yeah. Cordella reevaluates Sohn-Rethel's contribution by placing him within a much larger philosophical debate between monism and dualism, and thus illustrates the scope of critical theory's engagement with philosophy. Big section 2. Still have a little time. What are critical theories of the economic towards a heuristic-normative scheme based on Max Horkheimer? This is by Ronga. How to think philosophically about political economy. Now, how to think philosophically about political economy? Academic philosophy in general does not seem to be overly interested in political economy. Sorta. Two branches nevertheless concern themselves with economic questions, business ethics, and more recently, philosophy of economics. Note that neither is of great interest to business schools. Business ethics began as a variant of applied ethics in the 1970s, and has meanwhile established itself as a proper subdiscipline within academic philosophy. While philosophy of economics is still in the process of institutionalization, both types, it has a broader scope than business ethics, which focuses exclusively on normative questions and provides ethical guidelines, which no one follows. Philosophers of economics are philosophers whose work focuses on the theoretical, methodological, and ethical foundations of economics. Despite this difference, philosophy of economics and business ethics share the same foundation. Both accept the authority of the economic sciences when it comes to understanding economic reality. They do not call this competence into question and respond to theoretical, methodological, and normative problems only within the frame defined by the economic sciences. See behaviorism. Business ethics and philosophy of economics treat philosophical reflection as the handmaid of economics. To rephrase the famous topos used by medieval philosophy to describe the relationship between philosophy and theology. Back to scholasticism again. This way of thinking about the relationship between philosophy and political economy has very little to do with the conception of early critical theory. When Max Horkheimer became the director of the Institute for Social Research in 1931, he instantly posed the pressing question of how to think philosophically about the economy. There's probably never been any period in the history of modern philosophy where this relationship was more under scrutiny than in these early years. While the debate within the Frankfurt School did not amount to anything that could be called a definite result, the various discussions themselves are nevertheless of great pertinence to present-day discussion about what could and should be the scope of economic philosophy. In what follows, I will contribute to this debate by focusing on Max Horkheimer and the statements about philosophy and political economy found in his inaugural speech, The Present Situation of Social Philosophy and the Tasks of an Institute for Social Research of 1931, and his essay on, again, Traditional and Critical Theory of 1937, including the postscript of 1937. These documents are probably the most programmatic for early critical theory. And since Horkheimer took his responsibility as director of the Institute for Social Research seriously, not just like his forerunner, Carl Grimberg, his statements have a special status. They represent the attempt, it's a prescriptive attempt in that sense, of the director of the Institute to find the guidelines of how to think critically about political economy within the framework of critical theory. In other words, Horkheimer's statements can be used as a plausible source for answering the difficult question about what a critical theory of the economic should look like. This is exactly what Ronga's attempt to do in the following. It is important to note that in the main interest is not historical. That is, I'm not interested in reconstructing Horkheimer's statement within the broader context of Hegelian Marxism and the discussion among members of the Institute. See Part 1 above. Rather, or below, I will decontextualize them in order to propose a heuristic normative scheme. That may not be decontextualizing, but anyway, which allows us to understand and evaluate the different critical approaches to the economic that we see today. From business ethics and philosophy of economics to the complex field of post-Marxist theories, whatever the heck that is. Number 2, section 2 for this, the larger big section 2, extrapolating Horkheimer towards a heuristic normative scheme. In his inaugural speech and his essays mentioned above, Horkheimer determines 5 key features for a critical theory of the economic. The first is the renunciation of any claim to objectivity with regard to the economic realm. This criterion directly results from one of the essential features of critical theory, namely its rupture with the epistemological setup of traditional theory. Traditional theory holds tight to the Cartesian idea that the subject and object of knowledge are epistemologically separate. You could even argue that it's spatially and temporally. According to Horkheimer, critical theory calls this radically into question. It sees the subject and the object as always intertwined. Quote, the facts which our senses present to us are socially preformed in 2 ways, through the historical character of the object perceived and through the historical character of the perceiving organ. Oh, darned. Unquote. The critical theorist has to acknowledge the fact that it is impossible for one to gain objective access to the object of knowledge. This also holds true for theoretical engagement with the economic. Once critical theory presupposes that any economic discourse is necessarily subjective and partial, politics enters the picture. It's exactly this inclusion that prevents critical theory from itself becoming no more than an economic science. Quote, critical theory has never been reducible to specialized economic science. The dependence of politics on the economy has been its object, not its program. Well, it's 1937, and as a parenthetical, what happens when they talk about commodities, but that's another question. A second criterion, number 2 of 5, for critical thinking about the economic results from the overall goal of critical theory, the establishment of justice among men. Critical theorists are motivated by the hope of radically improving human existence. This means that with regard to their critical engagement with the economic, they are on the outlook for alternative economic structures that are no longer capitalist. Whereas Horkheimer has no reservations about using knowledge from the traditional sciences as long as it can contribute to the project of a rationally organized future society, he sees no value in the knowledge of the economic sciences. Their analyses, he maintains, are related to nothing and are calculated to hide reality at every point. For this reason, Horkheimer observes that, quote, the curves of the mathematical political economics of our day are no more able to maintain a link with essentials than are positivist or existential philosophy. And note that comparison. Concepts in these disciplines have lost any relation to the fundamental situations of the age, unquote. Economic sciences produce incorrect and misleading representations of the economic. Critical theory has therefore the task of criticizing and, yes, deconstructing mainstream economists' key concepts, preferably in the mode of immanent critique. That is, by presenting them as subject to dialectical reversal. Now, let me break there for a second and say, that's an interesting question. Can you do that to, for example, behavioral economics? Back to the text, Horkheimer, quote, unlike modern specialized science, the critical theory of society has continued to be a philosophical discipline even when it engages in a critique of the economy. For its content is the transformation of the concepts which dominate the economy into their opposites: fair exchange into a deepening of social injustice, a free economy into monopolistic control, productive work into rigid relationships which hinder production, and finally, the maintenance of society's life into the pauperization of the peoples, unquote. This dialectical critique can be ascribed as the third key feature of critical theories of the economic out of 5. However, critical theorists cannot content themselves with critique alone. They have to carry out their own economic analysis inspired by the ongoing historical transformations of the socioeconomic world. Quote, the critique of economism consists not in turning away from economic analysis, but in engaging it more fully and along the lines indicated by history, unquote. These historical analyses should be run, according to Horkheimer, in an interdisciplinary manner rather than multidisciplinary. Anyway, bringing together philosophers, economists, sociologists, psychologists, and so on. Philosophy must take the lead within this cooperation since it is the only discipline that guarantees that scientific investigations do not end up in mere positivistic accounts, but contribute to the most important goals of critical theory, namely to gain understanding and experience of the socio-economic present. The fifth requirement contains the premise of the economic analyses in question. In his inaugural speech, Horkheimer emphasized that critical theory must hold on to the distinction between the economical and the non-economical, i.e., or e.g., for example, the social, the cultural, the religious, without falling into the trap of badly understood Marx, badly understood Hegel, or bad Spinozism, unquote. Horkheimer states, it can be thus be asserted that economy and spirit are different expressions of one and the same essence. This would be bad Spinozism. Or alternatively, one maintains that ideas or spiritual contents break into history and determine the action of human beings. This would be an abstractly and thus badly understood Hegel. Or one believes contrariwise that the economy as material being is the only true reality. The psyche of human beings, personality, as well as law, art, and philosophy are to be completely derived from the economy, or mere reflections of the economy. This would be an abstractly and thus badly understood Marx. Such notions naively presuppose an uncritical, obsolete, and highly problematic divorce between spirit, this is spirit with a big S, as before, and reality, which fails to synthesize them dialectically. Critical theories of the economy have to maintain that the economic and the non-economic are separate, but at the same time dialectically intertwined, unquote. To sum up, in Horkheimer's most programmatic text, one can find 5 claims about the way in which, I'm ending soon, the way in which critical theory should deal with the economic world. Critical theorists, critical theorists should take a number one, non-objective, but partial approach to the economic that, number two, aims at an alternative, non-capitalistic economic order by 3, criticizing mainstream economic sciences, and 4, providing their own economic analysis guided by philosophy, while number 5, holding on to the dialectical relationship between the economic and the non-economic. These 5 claims can be used to design a heuristic normative scheme that allows us to understand and evaluate various present-day theoretical engagements with the economics. Subsection 3 of Part 2, using Horkheimer evaluating current critical approaches to the economic. Note, there's still more to read here, and it's going to go on for, well, we're almost to the end. I'll read to the end, and tough noogies. Using the heuristic normative scheme extrapolated from Horkheimer, one can easily see why business ethics, oxymoron, as well as philosophy of economics cannot become critical in the sense of critical theory. These disciplines accept the discourse of economic, quote unquote, hard sciences as authoritative. Yet, hence, they neither see their theoretical engagement as partial, nor do they attempt to criticize the key concepts of economic sciences or run their own economic analyses. Questioning the authority of mainstream economic sciences is, however, the precondition for establishing critical theories of the economic. It seems that this condition is satisfied by those theoretical projects broadly accepted as post-Marxist. But to what extent do they satisfy the other criteria extrapolated from Horkheimer's early text? Due to the wide range of feminist, post-structuralist, deconstructive, discourse theoretical, and neo-Marxist theories that can be subsumed under post-Marxism, it would go far beyond the scope of this introduction to answer the question posed above. In the following, I limit myself to demonstrating the productivity of the designed heuristic normative scheme with regard to just one example, namely the work of J.K. Gibson Graham, of which half, I think it's the Gibson part, has passed away quite a while ago, rest in power, who provides an influential feminist and post-structural critique of political economy. Uh, he, which is even more weird, they introduced the term capitalocentric. Gibson and Graham are both female, with all due respect. Number six, in order to emphasize that our thinking about economy is highly determined by the category of capitalism, fighting against the injustice of capitalism and for alternative economic structures demands opposing this hegemonic capital-centric discourse. And the construction of a new language of economic diversity that allows the subjects of alternative economic practices to understand these as viable, non-defective alternatives. This sketch of Gibson-Graham's approach already shows that most of the requirements for critical theories of the economic are satisfied. Their theoretical work is partial. It aims at a better economic order, is based on the deconstruction of mainstream economists' key concepts, and encompasses original economic analyses. However, the heuristic normative scheme raises the crucial questions of whether Gibson-Graham manages to avoid the trap of so-called bad Spinozism, since they consider the difference between the economic and the non-economic as expression of one and the same substance, namely the practice of political and ethical articulation. They might fall short of the last, but very essential feature of critical theories of the economics, of the economic. However, instead of working through the vast field of post-Marxian theories in order to confirm this assumption, I will now turn to present-day critical theory and evaluate its critical engagement with the economy. The philosophical work of Axel Honneth is here of particular interest. I'm almost done. Not only because he's frequently considered to be the most important representative of contemporary critical theory, but because the economic implications of his philosophy of recognition were the subject of intense debate. Nancy Fraser, among others, criticized Honneth's theory of recognition for being unable to offer an adequate understanding of economic reality. Since Honneth looks at economic matters through the lens of recognition, the argument goes, he is unable to acknowledge the economic sphere in its own right. Hence, he can neither identify the real economic causes behind economic injustice, nor present effective solutions. Emmanuel Renaud points out, however, that this criticism partly misses the point, since Honneth's overall goal is not to explain economic injustice, but to provide a theoretical framework for understanding the subjective experience of economic injustice. And Jean-Philippe Duranty calls attention to the fact that Honneth seems to be more critical towards positivistic economic approaches than his opponents, whose criticism is based on the assumption that there are real economic reasons that can be analyzed by the economic sciences. In fact, Honneth seems to be aware that any theoretical description of economic affairs has an effect on economic reality itself. See tariffs. Thus, he holds that the struggle over economic injustices can benefit from translating the experience of economic justice into a vocabulary that differs from the language of the economic sciences proper, such as the vocabulary of recognition. One could also read Honneth's attempt to reconceptualize the market as an institution of social freedom in his book Freedom's Right of 2014, as well as his plea for a more experimental approach towards the economic in his latest book on the idea of socialism in this context, 2015. In other words, Honneth's engagement with economic issues is far more critical, according to the criteria extrapolated from Horkheimer, than his critics realized. Indeed, one has to admit that Honneth also tends to fall short of that fifth criterion, since his discourse on the economic does not retain the difference between the economic and the non-economic. In this respect, Honneth's critics are right. His theory of recognition is not suited to acknowledging the exceptional position of the economic. They are wrong, however, if they think that conceptualizing the economic and the non-economic as different spheres would solve the problem. This way of thinking about the relationship in question might enable one to draw a distinction between the economic and the non-economic, for example, with regard to their characteristic modes of action. But it does not help to describe their dialectical entanglement. On the contrary, the language of spheres leads mostly to a merely antagonistic description of their relationship. Keyword, colonization of the life world. That signifies a whole bunch of other things. More promising in this respect seems to be the concept of forms of life, Lebensformen, recently reformulated by Rahel Jaegi, 2013. According to Jaegi, forms of life can be understood as an inner set, ensemble, bundle of social practices, whereby social practices also encompass economic practices in the strict sense, namely as practices that are concerned with the satisfaction of the reproductive needs of society. Or to be more precise, practices addressing economic concerns are always, already connected or even entangled with other non-economic practices and interpretations within this conceptual framework. The difference between the economic and the non-economic can be sustained without falling into the language of different spheres, like the paid and the unpaid, etc. It is an open question, however, whether Jaegi is able to identify the entanglement, quantum entanglement, between economic and non-economic practices as dialectical. If so, the concept of forms of life already employed by Horkheimer in order to replace the orthodox Marxian model of base and superstructure, which hopefully we've replaced a long time ago, appears to be a sound conceptual foundation for a critical theory of the economic in the tradition of the Frankfurt School. And so, yeah, we got to the end. I hope you can see kind of not only where this was going, but where I am going. And you can see that there's some interesting features of a current discourse deploying the Frankfurt School and not so much reinvigorating it, but considering it in its historical context, doing the same things that, people like Lukács were trying to kind of work through. What is that relationship between, spirit and economy or whatever? And these are interesting questions. They're still interesting questions because I think that, as we will see, there are real, even empirical examples to study, and that not only allow us to reconstruct, deconstruct, reconstruct theory, um, but also move to, I think, an interesting position, not only at the philosophical level, but in terms of providing something actionable, as they would say. So, anyway, that's all I have to say. Let's see if anyone had anything to say in the cats seeking attention. Um, Spirit with a big ass. Yes, yes.
But
Uh,
this is James. I have a question.
sure.
Uh, three or more times in your reading there, the phrase heuristic normative scheme has been used. I
Yes.
sort of understand what the word heuristic means as sort of
Yes.
a useful model for attempting to understand something. But what is a
Yes.
normative heuristic scheme, and how does that play out?
The normative would suggest that it is uh, if you're it is the move from simply a useful model to a model that can be more generalized.
Okay.
In other words, if we were using T.S. Kuhn as a notion of the community of scholars and incommensurability and all that other jazz in terms of the structure of scientific revolutions as heuristic, um, the normative application would be, as they did in the 1970s or late 60s, to apply the Kuhnian argument about scientific revolutions to, and which they did. I have, I have receipts. Um, to, for example, artistic revolution or new artistic movements, this would be, at least within the context of the art world, normative. Wouldn't be heuristic. It would be normative.
I got it. Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah, and then this is asking a lot, but is there any way you could summarize in 25 words or so or more what does the Frankfurt School maintain?
Oh, it maintains that several things. My interest in the political economy question is to bring it back to earth, um, as many do, um, because most people thought that, and this is not 25 words. The general opinion was that the Frankfurt School was a very interesting set of applications for people who are fleeing Nazism to try and rationalize how fascism happened. That's the first uh, assumption. And the second one is to evaluate its continuing relevance and an obvious continuing relevance to left politics in the late 20th and early 21st century. Is that
Okay, cool. Thank
I don't
you.
know if that's
That
25
was
words, but
useful. Yeah.
that's kind of where we are and where it's always been.
Uh-huh.
And this reading group is, looking at places that haven't been looked at or were looked at and nobody paid attention or new scholarship is necessary. For example, my assumption is, and that's just my impression, that James Crane, who has organized this little activity plus its journal and a variety of other activities, is doing a dissertation on Horkheimer, and he's translating a lot of Horkheimer that hitherto to this date maybe got translated, but no one ever did anything with them. And so his dissertation, I think, is going to be on something in there, and I don't quite know what it is. I assume every time he does one of these little things, it's a chapter in his dissertation. Um, and and I appreciate that because I think that raising, he's going in a different direction than I would. I mean, I would actually follow this line of inquiry. That is, um, you can spend all your time thinking about critical theory's new relationship or renewed relationship within certain types of contexts, but it does us no good until we reconcile ourselves with the economic. So I think that he's not going to get there because he's doing a dissertation. So whatever. Um, on the other hand, are trying to work out ways in which you can do both. Is that you can do an assessment of critical critical theories as heuristic, um, and see how, once you begin to see how it connects with empirical work, becomes normative or can become normative. In other words, um, it's quite possible to say uh, that there is a good connection between any revolution in any subfield, like a revolution in the art world, for example, with economic reality.
Hmm. Hmm. I see.
That
Cool.
that's a
Well,
very that's a very particular analysis and one that is obviously not actualized, not real. I find it quite amusing though. Okay, here's an example. There's a new set. I don't know if it's new, but it was done somewhat recently. Damien Hirst has a series of prints. It's a limited edition, as I think, and it is a series of paintings, as it were. Now, are they really paintings, or are they what they really are? And that is prints taken from Hearst using a spinning turntable, not unlike the spinning artwork that you could make at a carnival, with dropping pigment on a spinning uh, surface like paper or whatever. And it's spin art, right? So you would come away from your day at the carnival or the circus with something that resembled abstract expressionism, only ready made by a spinning turntable, not unlike cotton candy. And so he's selling these. I have no idea how much they're priced. I'm not so much obsessed with the price or that he did it or blah, 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 blah. I just think that's a fascinating. On the one hand, it is resorting to kind of a hackneyed ideas about modern art. On the other hand, he's just riffing at the same thing he's always been riffing at. You know, um, if you make something out of diamonds, and it's worth, whatever the hell it is, $32 million, you've improved the position of it as an artwork. But on the other hand, you can't do shit with it because you can't wear it. You can't, that's interesting. These are interesting little things.
Surely
Not,
you meant Cockney, not hackneyed.
yeah. Well, this is my Banksy approach to stuff here. So I'm trying to use concrete examples, and yes, it's cockneyed or cockeyed actually. Anyway,
Just imagine if Jackson Pollock had done his artwork standing on a turntable.
well, well, anyway, I don't.
He danced around. He danced to the
Indeed.
mambo, I think.
Indeed, this is that one little what's his name's film, reveals that. And well, anyway, let's not go there.
Well, thank you for answering my questions. Thank you.
I'm sorry I digressed there. I'm over. We have. Oh God, I was doing it with the fucking. Oh, excuse me, the effing.
Yes, yes. Please end the live stream.